Imagine an army so fearless, so devoted to truth and justice, that just the sight of them on the battlefield sent entire enemy lines into panic and retreat. These weren't mythical warriors, they were real men, handpicked by the Prophet Muhammad himself. Today, we reveal the 7 of the Prophet's most feared companions. Men whose courage shook empires, whose loyalty never wavered, and whose names still echo through history. If you've ever needed inspiration to stand firm in your faith or face your own battles with courage, this story is for you. If you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell, because we bring you powerful stories from Islamic history that ignite the soul, strengthen your iman, and remind you what true bravery looks like. Now, let's journey back to the golden age of Islam. In the blistering heat of 7th century Arabia, where survival often meant compromise and truth was buried beneath tribal pride, a revolution of the soul began. Not with armies, but with a single man in a cave, Muhammad, the final messenger of God. Around him, in the face of brutal persecution, social ostracism, and mortal danger, gathered a small band of men and women whose hearts burned with a conviction so pure, so unshakable, that it would eventually reshape the map of the known world. Among them were warriors. Not the kind glorified in myths or Hollywood epics, but real men forged in the crucible of faith, sacrifice, and divine purpose. These were the companions of the Prophet, Sahaba, whose names would echo through centuries not merely for their strength in battle, but for their unwavering loyalty to truth, justice, and the one God. In the early days of Islam, when the Muslim community in Mecca was small, vulnerable, and relentlessly oppressed, these men stood as human shields around the Prophet. They were merchants, shepherds, freed slaves, ordinary men transformed by an extraordinary calling. They endured beatings, starvation, exile, and the loss of family and status, all for the sake of a message that declared, "There is no God but Allah." Yet, when the time came to defend that message, not with aggression, but with righteous resistance, they rose not as conquerors, but as protectors of the innocent and enforcers of divine justice. And among them, 7 emerged whose very presence on the battlefield struck terror into the hearts of hardened generals and seasoned warriors. It wasn't just their skill with the sword or their physical might. It was the fire in their eyes, the certainty in their hearts, and the knowledge that they fought not for glory, but for the pleasure of Allah. Enemies would later recount how, upon seeing one of these men gallop toward their lines, entire regiments would falter. Commanders would hesitate. Horses would rear in panic. Not because these companions were demons, but because they moved with a fearlessness that defied human logic. While others fought for gold, land, or revenge, these men charged forward knowing that death held no power over them. For them, martyrdom was not an end, it was a homecoming. This spiritual armor made them invincible in the eyes of their foes. Their courage wasn't reckless, it was rooted in deep faith, discipline, and love for the Prophet. They didn't seek war, but when war came to them, they met it with such resolve that history itself bent in their favor. At the forefront of these legendary warriors stood Khalid ibn al-Walid, a man whose journey from enemy to champion of Islam remains one of the most dramatic conversions in religious history. Before embracing Islam, Khalid was one of the fiercest adversaries of the Muslim community. At the Battle of Uhud, it was his tactical brilliance that nearly turned the tide against the Prophet and his outnumbered followers. He led the Meccan cavalry in a devastating flank attack that caused chaos in the Muslim ranks. Yet, even then, something stirred within him, a recognition of the Prophet's nobility, the Muslims' resilience, and the undeniable truth of their cause. When Khalid finally accepted Islam in the 8th year after Hijrah, it wasn't out of convenience, but conviction. He walked into Medina, head bowed in humility, and said to the Prophet, "I come seeking forgiveness for all that I have done against you." Instead of reproach, the Prophet welcomed him with open arms and gave him a title that would immortalize him, Sayfullah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of Allah. From that moment on, Khalid's unmatched military genius was redirected toward defending the truth. He never lost a single battle in over 100 engagements, against the Byzantines, the Persians, and the rebellious tribes of Arabia. His campaigns across Syria and Iraq dismantled 2 of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, not through cruelty, but through strategy, speed, and divine support. What made Khalid truly feared wasn't just his tactics, it was his presence. He could appear where least expected, strike with lightning speed, and vanish before the enemy could regroup. At the Battle of Mu'tah, when 3 Muslim commanders fell in succession, the army was on the verge of collapse. It was Khalid who took command, reorganized the retreating forces, and executed a masterful tactical withdrawal that saved thousands of lives, earning the Prophet's highest praise. Later, during the Ridda Wars of apostasy, he crushed rebellion after rebellion, reuniting the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam in less than a year. But Khalid's greatness lay not only in war. He lived simply, shared food with his soldiers, and wept when reminded of the hereafter. Once, when offered the governorship of a wealthy province, he declined, saying, "I fight for the sake of Allah, not for palaces." His life was a testament to the idea that true power comes not from dominion over others, but from submission to the divine. And it was this combination, fearless in battle, humble in victory, that made enemies flee at the mere rumor of his approach. Armies that outnumbered the Muslims 10 to 1 would retreat upon hearing, "Khalid is coming." Not because they were weak, but because they faced a man who had already conquered his own soul. Thus, the legacy of these early companions, especially the first of our 7, Khalid ibn al-Walid, teaches us that transformation is possible, that even the fiercest opponent can become the greatest defender of truth, and that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the triumph of faith over it. In a modern world where many feel lost, divided, or overwhelmed by injustice, their stories are not just history. They are a mirror, a challenge, and a beacon. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Khalid ibn al-Walid in the pantheon of the Prophet's most fearless companions was a man whose name alone evokes awe across 14 centuries. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Lion of Allah, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and one of the first souls to embrace Islam. While others came to faith as adults, Ali was raised in the very household of revelation. As a young boy, he witnessed the Prophet receive his first divine message in the cave of Hira. At just 10 years old, he declared his belief in one God, making him not only among the earliest Muslims, but the first child to accept Islam. From that moment, his life became a living testament to loyalty, courage, and unwavering principle. Ali's bravery wasn't the kind that roared, it was the kind that stood silent in the storm. At the Battle of Uhud, when the tide turned against the Muslims and panic spread through the ranks, most companions fled to save their lives. But Ali remained. With sword in hand and eyes fixed on the Prophet, he formed a one-man shield against waves of enemy cavalry. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and dust choked the air, but Ali did not retreat. The Prophet himself later testified, "Ali is from me, and I am from Ali." In another narration he said, "There is no youth braver than Ali." His valor wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. He fought not for fame, but because he saw the messenger of Allah as the embodiment of divine truth, and protecting him was protecting the message itself. What made Ali truly feared by enemies wasn't just his unmatched strength or lightning-fast swordsmanship, it was his unbreakable moral compass. Even in the heat of battle, he refused to strike a fallen enemy or kill outside the bounds of justice. At the Battle of Khaybar, when Jewish strongholds seemed impregnable, it was Ali, sick with fever, who rose at the Prophet's call, took the banner, and shattered the gates with a single blow. The fortress fell not by numbers, but by divine support granted to a man whose heart was pure. His enemies knew, to face Ali was to face a warrior who answered to a higher law, one that forbade cruelty, honored covenants, and sought only to establish justice. Yet Ali's legacy extends far beyond the battlefield. He was a scholar, a judge, and a poet of profound wisdom. His sermons in Nahj al-Balagha remain masterpieces of Islamic thought, blending theology, ethics, and governance. But in the context of war, it was his presence that demoralized entire armies. Byzantine and Persian generals, who had never encountered such disciplined, principled fighters, would whisper in dread, "Beware the one with the radiant face and the black hair. He fights as if angels guard his back." And in truth, the Prophet once said during the Battle of the Trench, "Tomorrow, I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and his messenger, and whom Allah and his messenger love." The companions spent the night wondering who it could be. In the morning, the Prophet called for Ali, and the entire camp erupted in joy, for they knew victory was assured. Following Ali in our list of the Prophet's most feared companions is Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, a man so trusted that the Prophet himself declared, "Every ummah has a trustee, and the trustee of this ummah is Abu Ubaidah." Unlike the fiery intensity of Khalid or the lion-hearted might of Ali, Abu Ubaidah embodied calm authority, humility, and incorruptible integrity. He was among the first 10 promised paradise, and his leadership style reflected that divine assurance, just, compassionate, and utterly selfless. When the Muslim armies marched into Syria, it was Abu Ubaidah who was appointed supreme commander, not because he was the fiercest warrior, but because he was the most trustworthy. He led with fairness so profound that even conquered peoples preferred his rule over their own kings. In Damascus, after the city surrendered peacefully, he personally walked the streets to ensure that Christian churches were protected and that no harm came to civilians. His soldiers followed him not out of fear, but out of love, because they knew he would never ask them to do what he wouldn't do himself. But do not mistake his gentleness for weakness. When battle was necessary, Abu Ubaidah fought with quiet ferocity. At the Battle of Yarmouk, one of the most decisive clashes in human history, where 40,000 Muslims faced over 200,000 Byzantine troops, Abu Ubaidah held the center line with unwavering resolve. For 6 days, under scorching sun and relentless assault, he stood firm. He ate the same coarse bread as his soldiers, slept on the ground, and led from the front. His calm demeanor steadied the entire army. When a plague later broke out in the Muslim camp in Syria, many urged him to flee to safety. He refused. "I will not abandon my brothers," he said. And he remained, until the plague took his life. Even in death, he led by example. Next in this elite circle is Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a companion whose story begins not on a battlefield, but in the quiet defiance of a teenage boy standing up to his own mother. At just 17 years old, Sa'd embraced Islam in Mecca, becoming one of the very first converts. His mother, furious at his rejection of idolatry, vowed to starve herself to death unless he renounced his faith. For days, she refused food and water. Torn between filial love and divine loyalty, Sa'd went to the Prophet for guidance. Allah then revealed the verse, "But if they strive to make you associate with me things of which you have no knowledge, do not obey them, but accompany them in this world with appropriate kindness." Quran 31:15. Sa'd returned to his mother, gently placed food before her, and said, "Eat, mother, but I will not leave Islam." She relented, and though she never converted, she never again tried to force him. This early test of faith foreshadowed the immense role Sa'd would play in Islamic history. He was among the handful who migrated to Abyssinia, and later fought in every major battle alongside the Prophet. At Badr, he was one of the archers whose arrows turned the tide. The Prophet, watching him shoot with deadly precision, lovingly said, "Shoot, Sa'd. May my father and mother be sacrificed for you." A phrase of the highest honor in Arab culture. But Sa'd's greatest hour came not in Arabia, but in the heart of the Persian Empire. Appointed by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab to lead the Muslim army eastward, Sa'd faced the might of the Sassanid dynasty, centuries old, opulent, and militarily dominant. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the fate of civilizations hung in the balance. The Persian army, led by the legendary General Rustam, fielded war elephants, elite cavalry, and a force 10 times larger than Sa'd's. Yet Sa'd did not waver. He spent nights in prayer, consulted his commanders with humility, and inspired his men with speeches that blended faith and strategy. For 4 days, the battle raged. On the 4th night, known as Laylat al-Hara, the night of clamor, Muslims fought with such ferocity that the earth itself seemed to tremble. By dawn, the Persian army was shattered. Rustam was killed. The gates of Persia were flung open, not by greed, but by a young man who had once stood up to his mother for the sake of truth. Sa'd went on to found Kufa, one of Islam's great intellectual and military centers, and governed with justice so renowned that even his former enemies sent delegations to learn from his administration. He lived a simple life, refusing luxury, and died at the age of 80, still humble, still faithful, still remembered as the boy who chose Allah over everything. These men, Ali, Abu Ubaidah, and Sa'd, were not merely warriors. They were architects of a new moral order. They proved that strength without justice is tyranny, and that victory without mercy is hollow. In an age where power is often equated with domination, their lives offer a radical alternative. True power lies in submission to the divine, service to humanity, and courage rooted in conscience. And it is this combination, fearless in war, gentle in peace, unwavering in principle, that made their enemies flee not just from their swords, but from the very light they carried. The thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the dust-choked cries of battle. Amid it all, one figure surged forward like a storm given human form. Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, the Prophet's cousin, one of the earliest believers, and a warrior whose name alone could fracture enemy morale. From the moment he accepted Islam at just 15 years old, among the very first to do so, Zubayr dedicated his life to defending the truth with unmatched zeal. He was among the 10 companions personally promised paradise by the Prophet, and his battlefield record reads like an epic of divine support and human resolve. At Badr, Uhud, the Trench, Kaaba and beyond, Zubayr was always at the front lines, not seeking glory, but fulfilling a sacred trust. What set Zubayr apart was not just his physical prowess, but his lightning speed and tactical audacity. At the Battle of Yarmouk, one of history's most decisive military confrontations, where a vastly outnumbered Muslim army faced the full might of the Byzantine Empire, Zubayr executed a maneuver so bold it became legendary. While the main forces engaged in brutal frontal combat, Zubayr led a small cavalry unit on a daring flanking mission through treacherous ravines. Emerging unexpectedly behind enemy lines, he and his men struck the Byzantine command post with such ferocity that panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had stood firm for days suddenly broke ranks, convinced they were surrounded. The Byzantine general, unable to restore order, watched in horror as his army collapsed, not from overwhelming numbers, but from the psychological shock of Zubayr's surprise assault. Eyewitnesses later described him returning from that charge covered in dust and blood, his sword notched from combat, yet his eyes blazing with calm determination. When asked how he dared ride alone into such danger, he simply replied, "The messenger of Allah said, 'Paradise lies beneath the shade of swords. I only sought my place in it.'" This wasn't bravado, it was faith made flesh. Zubayr never fought for conquest. He fought to protect the vulnerable, uphold justice, and ensure that the message of monotheism could reach every corner of the earth. Even in victory, he remained humble. He refused lavish gifts, lived simply, and spent his nights in prayer. His fearlessness came not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty that if he died in the path of Allah, he would be welcomed home. Following Zubayr in our list of the Prophet's most feared companions is a man whose sacrifice at Uhud became a symbol of ultimate loyalty, Talha ibn Ubaydullah. On that fateful day, when betrayal and chaos threatened to extinguish the light of Islam, Talha did the unthinkable. He became a human shield for the Prophet with his own body. As arrows rained down from the Meccan archers, Talha stood firm, raising his arms to block the projectiles aimed at the messenger of Allah. One arrow pierced his hand, pinning it to the Prophet's cheek. Another struck his shoulder. Blood poured from his wounds, yet he did not flinch. He held his position until the immediate danger passed, shielding the Prophet with his flesh as others fled in confusion. The Prophet, deeply moved, later declared, "Whoever wishes to see a martyr walking on the face of the earth, let him look at Talha ibn Ubaydullah." Though Talha survived Uhud, the title "the living martyr" clung to him for the rest of his life, a testament to his willingness to give everything for the sake of truth. His bravery wasn't limited to that single moment. At the Battle of the Camel years later, even as political tensions divided the Muslim community, Talha fought not out of ambition, but out of a sincere desire to restore justice. He was struck by an arrow during the battle and died shortly after, fulfilling the Prophet's prophecy in both spirit and letter. Talha's generosity was as legendary as his courage. He was among the wealthiest men in Medina, yet he gave away nearly all his wealth for the sake of Allah. Once, during a famine, he distributed his entire fortune to the poor and went to bed with nothing but a prayer mat. The Prophet loved him deeply and often praised his character, saying, "Talha and Zubayr are my companions in paradise." Enemies knew that to face Talha was to face a man who valued the Prophet's safety more than his own life, and that kind of devotion is impossible to defeat with swords alone. And then there is Al-Miqdad ibn al-Aswad, a former slave who rose to become one of the most vocal and fearless champions of early Islam. Born in Abyssinia to African parents, Al-Miqdad was not of Arab lineage, yet his status among the companions was second to none. His story shatters every myth about race, class, or origin in Islam. In the eyes of the Prophet, worth was measured by faith and action alone. Al-Miqdad embraced Islam in secret during its most dangerous days in Mecca. When persecution intensified, he fled to Abyssinia with the first group of Muslim migrants, enduring exile for the sake of his belief. But it was at the Battle of Badr, the first major confrontation between Muslims and the Quraysh, that Al-Miqdad etched his name into eternity. The Muslim army, only 313 strong, faced a Meccan force of nearly 1,000 elite warriors. Doubt crept into the hearts of some companions. Would they stand? Could they win? Then Al-Miqdad rose. With fire in his voice and conviction in his stance, he addressed the Prophet in front of the entire army. "O Messenger of Allah, go wherever Allah commands you. By Allah, if you were to command us to dive into the sea, we would dive in. We will not say to you as the children of Israel said to Moses, 'Go you and your Lord and fight, you two. We will sit here.' No. We will fight on your right, on your left, in front of you, and behind you." The Prophet's face lit up with joy. He turned to his companions and said, "Take courage. Allah has promised me victory." In that moment, Al-Miqdad didn't just speak for himself. He gave voice to the unwavering resolve of the entire Ummah. His declaration became a turning point, lifting the army's spirit and silencing fear. From that day on, he was known as the first Muslim to publicly pledge total obedience in battle. He fought in every major campaign, always in the front lines, always with the same fearless heart. What made Al-Miqdad truly feared by enemies wasn't just his sword, it was his unshakable certainty. As a black man in a society that often valued lineage above all, he had every reason to feel inferior. Yet Islam gave him dignity, purpose, and honor. He carried that truth into battle like armor. Byzantine scouts, reporting back to their generals, would note, "Among them is a dark-skinned warrior who fights as if death fears him." And in a sense, it was true, because Al-Miqdad had already conquered death through faith. These three men, Zubayr, Talha, and Al-Miqdad, represent different facets of the same divine light. Zubayr with his tactical brilliance and relentless charge, Talha with his selfless sacrifice and noble heart, and Al-Miqdad with his defiant loyalty and revolutionary spirit. They came from different backgrounds, yet they stood united in one cause, the protection and propagation of Islam. Their enemies didn't just lose battles to them, they lost the will to fight, because you cannot defeat men who have already surrendered their souls to the Almighty. In today's world, where courage is often reduced to social media posts and real sacrifice is rare, their stories are a wake-up call. They remind us that true strength lies not in numbers, but in conviction, not in weapons, but in unwavering faith. And when the Prophet looked upon these men, he saw not just warriors, but living proofs of Allah's promise. Indeed, Allah will support those who support him. Quran 22:40. These legendary companions did not rise to greatness by accident. They were forged in the fires of persecution, exile, and existential threat. Yet they never allowed fear to dictate their choices. Their courage was not the reckless bravado of mythic heroes, but the quiet, disciplined resolve of men who had tasted the sweetness of faith and would rather die than betray it. And perhaps no moment better captures this spirit than the early days of Islam in Mecca, when simply uttering La ilaha illallah could cost you your family, your wealth, or your life. In that crucible of truth, men like Al-Miqdad ibn al-Aswad, already mentioned for his historic declaration at Badr, stood tall not because they sought fame, but because silence in the face of falsehood was unthinkable. His bold words, "Go wherever Allah commands you, we will follow you into the sea," were not just rhetoric, they were a covenant with the divine. And that covenant echoed through every battle, every migration, every sleepless night spent guarding the Prophet's door. But the legacy of these warriors extends far beyond their battlefield exploits. What truly terrified their enemies was not just their skill with the sword, but the moral authority they carried. They fought with rules: no killing of women, children, monks, or farmers, no burning of crops, no destruction of places of worship. When Khalid ibn al-Walid entered Damascus, he signed a treaty guaranteeing the safety of all Christian lives and churches. A document so just that historians still cite it as a model of early Islamic governance. When Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas conquered Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, he refused to sit on the emperor's throne, saying, "I left it for one who fears Allah more than I do." This was not weakness, it was strength refined by submission to a higher law. And it was this fusion of might and mercy that made their enemies not only lose battles, but lose the will to resist. How do you fight men who show you kindness after victory? How do you hate those who protect your family when they could have enslaved them? This moral clarity is what makes their stories so relevant today, especially in the Americas, where many struggle with questions of identity, purpose, and justice. In a world saturated with violence stripped of meaning, the lives of these companions offer a radical alternative. True power is not domination, but responsibility. True courage is not aggression, but restraint. And true victory is not measured in territory gained, but in dignity preserved, for friend and foe alike. When Talha ibn Ubaydullah shielded the Prophet with his bleeding hands at Uhud, he wasn't just protecting a man. He was defending a message that declared the equality of all human beings before God. When Abu Ubaidah walked barefoot through plague-stricken camps to comfort his soldiers, he wasn't performing charity. He was embodying leadership as service. These were not perfect men, but they strove for perfection in their devotion, and that striving is what made them giants. Today, Muslims in the United States, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, and across the Americas face their own Uhuds. Not with swords, but with prejudice, misinformation, and spiritual fatigue. Some feel isolated in schools, workplaces, or neighborhoods where their faith is misunderstood or mocked. Others wrestle with doubt, wondering if standing firm is worth the cost. But the stories of these companions are a lifeline. They remind us that faith has always been tested, and that every generation is called to its own battlefield. Yours may not be a desert in Arabia or a plain in Syria, but it is no less real. It might be the courage to wear your hijab with pride, to speak truth in a room full of lies, to forgive when revenge is easier, or to give when you have little. These are the modern acts of jihad, the greater struggle, and they require the same heart that once charged at Badr with 313 souls against 1,000. And let us not forget, these companions were not born fearless. They trembled. They doubted. They wept. But they chose to move forward anyway, because their love for Allah and His Messenger was greater than their fear of death. That is the secret of their invincibility. In a culture that often equates vulnerability with weakness, their humanity is profoundly liberating. You don't have to be perfect to be brave. You don't have to be strong to start. You only need to take one step in the right direction, and trust that Allah will carry you the rest of the way. The Prophet once said, "The strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, while there is good in both." Strength here isn't muscle, it's steadfastness. It's getting up after failure. It's praying when you feel distant. It's standing when everyone else sits. This is why their enemies fled at the sight of them. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. Deep down, even the most hardened warrior could sense that these men carried something beyond human power, the light of divine certainty. And light, by its very nature, dispels darkness. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot corrupt it. You can only flee, or surrender to it. Many enemy soldiers, after witnessing the mercy and discipline of the Muslim armies, converted on the spot. Not because they were forced, but because they saw in these companions a reflection of the truth they had been missing all their lives. In the Americas, where individualism often overshadows community, and success is measured by wealth or fame, the example of these companions offers a counter-narrative. They achieved immortality not through monuments, but through service. Not through self-promotion, but through selflessness. Khalid never wrote a memoir. Ali never sought a throne. Saad never named a city after himself. Their legacy lives not in stone, but in the hearts of those who hear their stories and feel a spark ignite. If they could do that, maybe I can too. That spark is what this series is about. Not just recounting history, but resurrecting its spirit. Because the world doesn't need more warriors with swords, it needs more people with the courage of Zubayr, the loyalty of Talha, the integrity of Abu Ubaidah, and the defiant faith of Al-Miqdad. It needs men and women who will stand when it's hard, speak when it's risky, and serve when no one is watching. And the beautiful truth is, you don't need an army to start. You only need one decision, to choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and faith over fear. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the challenges of modern life, whether it's discrimination, loneliness, moral confusion, or spiritual dryness, remember Uhud. Remember Badr. Remember Yarmouk. Remember the man who stood alone so the message could live. And know this, the same God who strengthened them is with you now. The same light that guided them can guide you. And if you walk with that light, even your enemies, doubt, fear, despair, will flee at the sight of your resolve. Imagine what our world could look like if even a fraction of us embodied the sincerity, discipline, and resolve of these 7 companions. Not their swords, but their souls. Not their battles, but their beliefs. In an age where social media rewards outrage over integrity, where success is often measured by followers rather than character, and where moral compromise is disguised as realism, the legacy of these men is a revolutionary call to return to what truly matters. They didn't build empires for personal glory, they built civilizations rooted in justice, knowledge, and compassion. Their conquests were not about erasing cultures, but elevating humanity, freeing people from the tyranny of kings and idols, and inviting them to the dignity of servitude to the one God. And it was this higher purpose that made their courage unstoppable. Consider this: within a single generation, a small group of desert dwellers, once divided by tribal feuds and idol worship, united under the banner of La ilaha illallah and dismantled 2 of the most powerful empires in human history, Byzantium and Persia. How? Not through superior numbers or technology, but through a spiritual force so potent it turned fear into faith, and sacrifice into victory. Khalid ibn al-Walid marched through deserts with no water, trusting in divine provision. Ali ibn Abi Talib judged disputes with such fairness that even non-Muslims sought his court. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas governed a province larger than France with a staff smaller than a modern city council. Their efficiency wasn't bureaucratic. It was born of trust in Allah and accountability to the people. This is the forgotten secret of Islamic civilization. Its strength came not from wealth, but from taqwa, God consciousness. And that is precisely why their enemies didn't just lose territory, they lost hope. When Byzantine generals saw Muslim soldiers praying in formation before battle, sharing their last loaf of bread, and treating prisoners with dignity, they realized they weren't fighting mere men. They were facing a community bound by something deeper than blood or gold, a covenant with the divine. You cannot defeat an army that sees death as a doorway to paradise and victory as a trust from God. That's why entire cities opened their gates without a fight. Not out of fear, but out of awe. They saw in these companions a reflection of the justice they had long been denied under corrupt rulers and oppressive systems. Today, in cities from Los Angeles to Sao Paulo, Toronto to Bogota, millions search for meaning in a world that feels increasingly fragmented. Many feel spiritually exhausted, caught between the noise of consumerism and the silence of secularism. But the stories of these companions offer more than history, they offer healing. They remind us that true strength isn't found in never falling, but in rising every time you do. That leadership isn't about commanding others, but serving them. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, because your values are worth more than your comfort. When Talha ibn Ubaydullah stood at Uhud with arrows piercing his hands, he wasn't thinking about legacy. He was thinking, if the Prophet falls, the message falls. And I cannot let that happen. That single-minded devotion to a cause greater than oneself is the antidote to modern apathy. And let us be clear, this isn't just for Muslims. The virtues these men embodied, loyalty, humility, justice, resilience, are universal. A Christian nurse in Chicago, a Jewish teacher in Buenos Aires, a secular activist in Vancouver. They too can draw inspiration from men who chose principle over power. Because at its core, this story isn't about religion as ritual, it's about faith as action. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide to live by extraordinary standards. The Prophet didn't choose his companions for their lineage or wealth. He chose them for their hearts. And that means anyone, regardless of background, race, or past, can walk this path. Al-Miqdad ibn al-Aswad, a former slave of African descent, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Qurayshi elite and was honored above them. In Islam, your worth is written not in your passport, but in your character. That's why these companions built societies where knowledge flourished, hospitals were founded, and scholars of all faiths debated in peace. Within a century of the Prophet's death, the Islamic world became the intellectual heart of the globe, preserving Greek philosophy, advancing medicine, pioneering algebra, and mapping the stars. And it all began with men who could barely read, but who loved truth so deeply they were willing to die for it. Their legacy teaches us that civilization doesn't begin with technology, it begins with conviction. So when you feel small in the face of global injustice, remember, change has always started with a few faithful souls. When you're tempted to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, remember Zubayr charging alone into enemy lines, not because he was sure of victory, but because silence was betrayal. When you're weary from standing up for your values, remember Abu Ubaidah choosing to die with his men in a plague rather than abandon them. Their lives whisper to us across centuries, you are stronger than you think. Your faith is your fortress, and your integrity is your legacy. In the end, the true measure of these companions wasn't how many battles they won, but how many hearts they awakened. They didn't leave behind palaces, but principles. Not statues, but stories that still stir the soul. And that is the kind of immortality worth pursuing. So the next time you face your own battle, whether it's speaking up for what's right, protecting your family's values, or simply staying true to your conscience in a world that demands compromise, remember, you carry the same light that once made empires tremble. And if you let it shine, even your doubts will flee at its radiance. Because the greatest warriors aren't those who conquer lands, but those who conquer their own fears, for the sake of truth.